Okay, hello everyone, good evening. Nice to see you again this week. Do let me know if you can hear me. So I'll pop a message in the chat box, but do let me know if you can hear me. Hello everybody. Bonsoir à tous. Good evening everyone. Hello, hello. So hello Jean-Fabrice, hello Marie-Hélène, hello Abdelatif, hello Monique. Hopefully some more of you will join us as we go along. Hi Delphine, hi Françoise. Welcome to our next streaming for this week. We'll wait a minute to see if some more people join us and then we will get started. I hope you are as excited as I am for this week's lesson. Okay, so hi Isabel, hi Corinne. My apologies. Hi, my son. Your name has come up differently as your account, but my apologies for getting your name wrong. Okay. I hope everyone is well to this evening. Okay. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Thierry. Nice of you to join us. Okay, let's get started and hopefully some more people will join us along the way. So, following last week's lesson on the origins of the English language and the week before that, we discussed the British Isles, the geography of the British Isles. We're continuing on this theme of the history and culture of the British Isles in order to give you some insight into the history and the culture, funnily enough, of the British Isles, and hopefully I can give you a little bit of insight into sort of the country where I'm from. Okay, so why is monarchy so central to British culture? Because this evening we're talking about monarchy, or more specifically the monarchies, the various different royal families that have existed and ruled over the British Isles. There's going to be more of a focus on sort of England, as that tends to be sort of where there's some more history that I know about, but I have tried to do a bit of research into some of the history and culture of the other constituent parts of the UK in order to talk about that as well. But yes, why is monarchy so central to British culture? So I would argue that monarchy is both a source of division and unity. It's been a symbol of division and unity for many people over many centuries. Monarchy has seen wars, but it has also seen inspiration, and as I say, unity drawn from it. So we have this strange relationship with the monarchy in the UK, where it represents both historically and currently division on the one hand and unity on the other. So monarchy is quite central to British culture, but its importance perhaps has ebbed away over the years and over the centuries, and so the role of the royal family and the role of monarchy has changed with British society. Okay, so question for you to start off with: how many monarchies are there in the world? Does anyone know how many monarchies there are in the world? How many monarchies are there in the world? Take a guess. And we're assuming there's roughly 200 countries in the world, roughly speaking. So how many monarchies are there in the world? Does anyone take a guess? So Catherine has said 50. Has anyone else got any other guesses? So Marie-Hélène has said 10. Anya's not quite sure. So Catherine was actually very close. It's just under 50. And essentially, yes, there aren't that many proportionally speaking, that many monarchies left in the world. So monarchy is very much a small minority in terms of the governments or the kinds of forms of power that we have in the world. Monarchy is almost a dying structure. Less and less, or fewer and fewer, I should say, countries are monarchies. And there are different kinds of monarchies, so not all monarchies are the same. But the British monarchy represents the fact that, you know, we have a monarchy, whereas many of our European and, by extension, our international neighbours are not monarchies. Okay? So, by definition, what is the opposite of a monarchy? So, a monarchy has a monarch, which means a king or a queen, or some form of king or queen, perhaps with various variations of translations into other languages. What is the opposite of a monarchy? So, France is an example of this. Yes, so Françoise and Jean-Fabrice and Catherine have said correctly, a republic. So a republic is the opposite of a monarchy. So, for example, many countries became republics after they got rid of their monarchies. So France had the French Revolution, Russia had the Russian Revolution, where various members of the monarchy are killed, but in other countries, the monarchies have been ousted by democratic purposes. So, Monique, we can't quite say that the opposite of monarchy is democratic or a democracy, because we could argue that the UK is a democracy, but also has a monarchy. So we have both coexisting at the same time. But yes, republic is the opposite of a monarchy. And there are various people over the years in the UK who have been both for making the UK a republic and against making the UK a republic. Okay? So we're going to do a whistle-stop tour of some of the early history of British monarchy, so pre-United Kingdom, when there were various kingdoms existing in the British Isles. So after the Romans left Britain, or the province of Britannia, there were various kings that emerged during the medieval period. So we'll call the medieval period, or we can also call this the Middle Ages, donc le Moyen Âge. So we had kings like Alfred of Wessex, Griffith ap Llywelyn in Wales, and of course William the Conqueror, who came from Normandy. You may remember that I spoke about William the Conqueror coming from the north of France and conquering England and becoming King of England, which is why we have so much French influence in the English language, because there became this Anglo-Norman relationship. This came to fruition. So yes, we have this history within the medieval period of various kings of the various parts of the British Isles before sort of the nations of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland and Ireland emerged. So we have sort of histories of local kings of perhaps smaller regions, much like many other European countries, France included. Okay, so we're not going to dwell too much on this part because we're focusing today on sort of British monarchies, so we're going to move a bit further through time. We're going to move into the early modern period. So this is sort of exiting the medieval period, sort of after the 1500s, roughly, so post 1500s, as we move into the early modern period. So a famous aspect, in England at least, of monarchy was the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses. Now this was essentially a power struggle for the English throne being the right to have power. So we had two families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Okay, so we have the House of Lancaster represented by a red rose and the House of York represented by a white rose. So you may see this rose in various old English flags, maps, buildings. The rose has become a symbol of England, but we have the red rose and the white rose representing the two families or the two branches of a family that fought for power in England. Now, some of you may have watched HBO's Game of Thrones, and much of Game of Thrones is inspired by the Wars of the Roses. So does anyone know, perhaps, the similarities between York and Lancaster with the names of two warring families in Game of Thrones? So the House of York and the House of Lancaster. It's very similar to two families in Game of Thrones. Does anyone know? Let's see if anyone's a Game of Thrones fan. If not, don't worry, we'll come on to it in a second. Let's see, does anyone have any ideas? So we have the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Let's see if anyone knows. Okay, I don't think we have any Game of Thrones fans here. So, in Game of Thrones, we have House Stark and House Lannister. So House Stark is based on the House of York, and House Lannister is based on the House of Lancaster. So these are the two families warring against each other in England for the throne, and these are also the two families fighting against each other for power in Game of Thrones. Okay, Game of Thrones is le trône de fer, if anyone is misunderstanding what I'm talking about. So we have the two families, les deux familles, dont la série Le Trône de Fer. Donc on a les Stark et les Lannister qui sont représentés, qui représentent la famille de York et la famille de Lancaster. Donc il y a des parallèles entre les deux, parce que l'auteur a été inspiré par the Wars of the Roses. So the author was inspired by the Wars of the Roses. Okay, so moving after this, we have a very, very, very famous king who sort of follows this period, and his symbol is both the red and the not necessarily his symbol, but eventually the red and the white rose come together to form the Tudor rose, which represents or is a symbol of England and English monarchy. So does anyone know the name of the famous king who had 6 wives? He had 6 wives. So we have a famous king of England who had 6 wives. Does anyone know who that might be? Okay. Yes, so you've all got it. Henry VIII. Okay, so Henry VIII. So we represent this with Roman numerals with VIII. So Henry VIII. Henry VIII. Yes, so he had 6 wives. Okay, so in English we have a very interesting way of remembering what happened to each of Henry's 6 wives, okay? So we have Catherine of Aragon. So Francois said at the same time. No, so he had one wife after the other, and they all sort of had different endings to their lives. So we have Catherine of Aragon, then Anne Boleyn, then Jane Seymour, then Anne of Cleves, then Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr. Now, there were variations of the spellings of Catherine, so I apologise if I've used the wrong spelling for Catherine, because this is before spelling was standardised. So the name Catherine sometimes changes in terms of its spelling. So those were the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And we have a rhyme in English to remember what happened to all of them. So Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage. So he wanted to cancel, he wanted to say the marriage never happened because she couldn't produce children for him, or wasn't producing a son for him, I should say, so an heir to the throne. So she was divorced or annulled. Yes, so Rosanna has pointed out that he asked for a new religion to get married again. So at this time, England was linked to the Roman Catholic faith, so the Papal States, the Vatican, okay? And Henry VIII, in order to get his divorce, had to break away from the Catholic Church, and he founded the Church of England, which is now the national church of England today. So this is a very important event because it sees the separation of England from the sort of Catholic powers of the Vatican, and it shows a separation from other Catholic countries, which caused many conflicts later on. So yes, Rosanna, you're correct. So Catherine of Aragon was annulled or divorced. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery, so having relations with other people outside of marriage. She was also accused of being a witch, and she was beheaded. So she was beheaded. She had her head taken off. Then we have Jane Seymour. So Jane Seymour died. She died. We then have Anne of Cleves. And supposedly the story is that Henry was shown a painting or a drawing of Anne of Cleves, and she looked very beautiful. But when he saw her in person, he apparently referred to her as looking like a mare, which is an old term for like a mule, a horse, or a donkey. So he essentially said she had the face of a horse, and so he divorced her. We then move on to Catherine Howard. So Catherine Howard was also accused of adultery. So she was also beheaded. Okay. And finally, we have Catherine Parr, who survived Henry. She outlived Henry. Henry died before she did. So we have this saying: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So the first wife was divorced, the second was beheaded, the third died, the fourth was divorced, the fifth was beheaded, and the final wife survived. So Isabel is asking, when did Henry VIII reign? Henry VIII reigned during the 1500s, I believe. Let me just look up the exact dates. So he was king from 1509 until 1547. So I'll write that down, 1509 to 1547. Monique has asked, what is the nationality of his different wives and religions? Okay. I'm not sure about religions. I imagine Catholic, and then that changed over time to Protestant. But Catherine of Aragon, well, Aragon, the House of Aragon is from Spain, so I imagine she had Spanish roots. But yes, and then the majority of them were English, although Anne of Cleves was from Germany, I believe. Okay, so that is the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and following this, Henry's children and descendants led to, because of his choice to divorce Anne Boleyn, he triggered this religious sort of conflict in England. So we went backwards and forwards from Catholic to Protestant monarchs. So each one would have their own religion, and usually they would persecute the opposite. So yes. Okay. So essentially this takes us nicely up to when we start to see British monarchy come together. Okay. So in 1603, we see King Jacob, I think. King James. My apologies. So we have James VI of Scotland, also known as James I in England. So in 1603 he comes to power, and there is a union between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. So we see the two linked together. About 100 years later, in 1707, is the famous Act of Union, and this is arguably the beginning of the United Kingdom. So the country we have today, the UK, because it's this first joining of under law of the kingdoms of England and Scotland. Okay, and afterwards, of course, it expanded and grew and incorporated other areas of the British Isles. But it was this moment in 1707 that the UK sort of began to take the form that it has in the modern day. Okay? So we'll move on from the early modern period. We also have a very famous monarch that many of you might know, known as Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria. Okay? So Queen Victoria is colloquially known as the grandmother of Europe, the grandmother of Europe. And this is because many of her children married the various royal families of Europe. And so many of the royal families of Europe are descendants of Queen Victoria, such as royal family members of Denmark, of Spain, of Russia, and of Norway, I believe, as well. There are various royal families that can be linked back to Queen Victoria. Okay, so the question that let's have a look at these questions I'm being asked here. So there was also a War of the Jacobites. Yes, yes. Let's have a look. See. So, okay, so Queen Anne was the queen during the Act of Union. I'm not an expert on this period of history, my apologies, but if you look it up online, it should be there. So yes, we have Queen Victoria, whose children and grandchildren formed many of the royal families of Europe. She was also very famous because she was of German descent, and so she represents the German lineage within the British royal family. Okay. So moving on from Queen Victoria, that brings us to the modern day. We have skipped over some of the main other important monarchs, but we'll come back to them a bit later. Okay, so talking about the modern day, who is the current monarch of the UK? Who is the Queen? Who is the Queen? So who is the current Queen? Donc, qui est la reine actuelle au Royaume-Uni? Yes, so you've all got it. It's Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II. And funnily enough, she has been the longest reigning British monarch. Okay, so she has been in power for over 68 years. Okay, So she has been in power for a long time. Okay, and she is currently, I believe, the 4th longest reigning monarch in the world. So we will see if she perhaps surpasses what other monarchs have historically, or the period that other monarchs have historically reigned for. I think she's a few years away from being the longest reigning monarch in history, but she's definitely the longest reigning monarch in British history. She overtook, donc elle a dépassé her grandmother, Queen Victoria. Great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. So she surpassed Queen Victoria. Yes, so Françoise has rightly pointed out that we write Elizabeth with a Z like this, Elizabeth II. Okay, but we know that Elizabeth II is not the first Elizabeth. There was an Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VIII. She is the famous queen with red hair who refused to marry. So she refused to marry to have a husband. And she, yes. So we saw her Jubilee a few years ago. So Catherine saw the Jubilee. Okay, so Maisan has asked, how did she become queen? Okay, so Queen Elizabeth II became queen because her uncle abdicated. So to abdicate. So he gave up the throne. So it then passed to her brother, who was Elizabeth's father. Okay, so Elizabeth wasn't meant to be queen. However, she eventually became queen because her uncle Edward abdicated and her father George became king. Okay, and many of you may have seen this in the ever popular series, The Crown. Okay, so The Crown is a fictional but semi-biographical, I say semi-biographical, it's a fictional drama, but it recounts the lives and history of Queen Elizabeth, how she came to power, and how sort of her rule has progressed over the years. Okay, so let's have a think. Who can tell me? There are many countries, for example, in the world who still have Queen Elizabeth as their queen. So who can tell me some countries where Queen Elizabeth is still the queen of? So obviously we have the UK. These countries are known collectively as the Commonwealth, and they are depicted in this series called The Crown. Okay? So we have the UK. Does anyone know any other countries? Yes, so Catherine has said Australia. Australia is a good example. New Zealand is a good example. So Spain, not Spain. So Spain has its own monarchy. Queen Elizabeth is not the Queen of Spain. It's not part of the Commonwealth. Nor is Ireland. Ireland is not part of the Commonwealth. It was formerly part of the Commonwealth, but is no longer. Okay. No, don't worry. You don't need to apologise. It's easy to make the mistake. Okay. Yes, so many Pacific islands, such as I think Fiji was depicted. So Fiji, I don't think, yes, Fiji I don't think is one of the Commonwealth states. I think it formerly was, but there are other Pacific Isles that were part of the Commonwealth. Canada, yes. Canada still sees Queen Elizabeth as the Queen. And some other Caribbean islands, yes. Yes, you are correct. Yes, and Sri Lanka was previously, India and Sri Lanka were previously part of the Commonwealth, but are now distanced from it. Yes. Okay. Okay. So that brings us nicely to the end of our lesson. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, then by all means, feel free to message us at the Cercle de Langues team. And I hope this has been informative and interesting. I know it can be very difficult because I'm firing lots of information at you, but I hope it has been interesting all the same. And if you're confused or have questions, then by all means, please do ask. So, on that note, I hope you have a lovely evening. Je vous souhaite une bonne soirée. And I will see you next week for our next cours collectif. Donc, à la semaine prochaine pour notre prochain cours collectif. Pas cours collectif, pas pour notre YouTube Live. My apologies, I'm confusing our lessons. Our next YouTube Live. But yes, so have a nice evening and see you next week. Bonne soirée à tous et à la semaine prochaine. Bonne soirée, au revoir. Thank you, merci beaucoup, au revoir.